cannot love Madeleine more than I love her. You know, I would never have taken a risk. It was something that wasn't even a decision. That's how safe it felt, you know.
What
and it didn't
information
help.
did we have to suggest it wasn't going to be safe? We were dining 50 yards away. We were making regular checks. We were going into the apartment, always quiet, every night. And if we had thought it was unsafe for a minute, if there was any conscious element that somebody was going to go into that apartment and steal your child, then of course we wouldn't have done that.
But it wasn't just a matter of being unsafe, was it? I mean, is it the case? You can clear it up right here now. Was Madeleine upset the night before about being left alone? Had she had a moment, got out of bed, started crying and started looking for you?
I mean, I don't want to dwell on it too much. I mean, I don't know if you saw the documentary last night, so I mean, I have talked about it. Madeleine made a comment in passing that, where were you when I cried? Not just to Mummy, by the way, just generally. And it just seemed a bit odd. I mean, it was a very kind of passing remark, and we just thought she doesn't usually wake up, and she woke up, that means that, you know, she must have fallen back asleep very quickly. And then she moved on. You know, she moved on.
Anybody with young children will understand that children cry, they wake up at night. During that week, there was one night, and we can't give too much detail because it's part of the investigation file, but there was one night where Madeleine had come through and one of the other twins was crying. So, you know, and when she did mention it to us and we asked her about it, and she just dropped, she was completely fine. And we thought, was it when they were bathing, getting them, you know, first putting them down in that period when they're really tired? Of course, with hindsight, in the context of what happened, of Madeleine being abducted, it's put in a very different light, and it's put in a very different light to us, and of course we emphasise that.
If Madeleine hadn't been abducted, we'd never have thought of that comment.
Words cannot describe the anguish and despair that we are feeling.
Around 7 p.m., the children were put to bed in apartment 5A. Madeline, 3 years old, slept between her stuffed toy, cuddle cat, and a pink blanket she carried everywhere. Her younger twin siblings, Sean and Amelie, slept nearby. The patio door was left unlocked, a detail that seemed harmless then, but would later become one of the most debated choices in criminal history. Kate and Jerry said it was for convenience, to make it easier to check on the children while dining with friends just 55 meters away. But that single unlocked door would soon unravel an entire narrative. At 10 p.m., Kate's screams split the night. "They've taken her!" The words echoed down the narrow paths of the resort, piercing through the air with a mix of horror and certainty. But certainty of what? There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. Just an open window, a raised shutter, and an empty bed. From that moment on, the world would never look at the McCanns the same way again. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann ignited an international storm of empathy and suspicion. Newspapers called it a tragedy. Investigators called it confusion. And the public began to wonder whether this was truly the work of a stranger or something far more unsettling. In those first few hours, as police arrived too late and evidence was already disturbed, one chilling question began to take shape. Was this really an abduction or the beginning of a carefully constructed cover story? Because when you rewind the night, when you trace every decision, the unlocked door, the distance from the restaurant, the quick jump to "they've taken her," it all starts to look less like panic and more like preparation. A performance that began long before the scream, staged under the calm glow of a Portuguese sunset. And so, to find out what really happened, we must go back to the beginning, before the scream, before the missing child, before the world turned its eyes to apartment 5A. Hours before the world knew her name, Madeleine Beth McCann was just a cheerful 3-year-old on a seaside holiday with her parents and twin siblings. She loved swimming, chasing butterflies, and falling asleep with her faded pink blanket clutched against her cheek. To outsiders, the McCanns seemed like the perfect British family abroad, educated, successful, disciplined. But beneath the calm surface, there were cracks, both visible and hidden. That evening, around 7 p.m., Kate and Jerry followed what they called their routine. The twins were tucked into their cots, Madeleine placed in her small bed in the main bedroom beside the window. The front door was locked, but the sliding patio door was deliberately left open. It was meant, they said, to make it easier for them and their friends to check on the children during dinner. They claimed it was safe, the resort quiet, their table just 55 meters away. But what they didn't know, or perhaps didn't admit, was that their choice that night would ignite the greatest storm of suspicion in modern true crime. Days before, Madeleine had woken during the night and asked her mother, "Why didn't you come when we were crying?" It was a small sentence, the kind only a child could say without knowing its weight. To some, it was innocent. To others, it was a warning, a sign that something had already gone wrong in apartment 5A. When investigators later heard this line, they saw it not as a child's passing question, but as a premonition, a glimpse into the unease that hovered around the McCann household. The couple's decision to leave 3 toddlers alone while dining nearby seemed careless enough. But once you add what came next, the medical supplies, the empty vials, the unexplained sedatives, the story darkens. Kate McCann, a trained anesthesiologist, had access to injectable medications. Reports later suggested she had brought several vials on the trip, some later found empty. Officially, they were for personal use. Unofficially, investigators wondered if they had been used to keep the children asleep during those nightly dinners. It was a detail too uncomfortable for most to believe. A mother possibly sedating her own child for convenience. But when matched with later forensic alerts, the scent of death on Madeleine's toy, on Kate's clothing, and traces found in their rental car, the theory gained a sinister shape, that Madeleine may have died before the night even began. Behind the closed curtains, the McCanns' marriage was also under quiet strain. Kate had suspected Jerry of an affair back home, and reportedly bought a small spy pen to record him. Friends would later describe tension, exhaustion, and emotional distance. To outsiders, these details felt irrelevant, but to investigators reconstructing the night, they mattered. They revealed distraction, anxiety, and perhaps a household already walking a fragile line between love and collapse. When you gather these fragments, the sedation, the tension, the remark of a crying child, it paints a picture not of a random crime, but of a fragile family about to break. And as the sun sank behind the hills of Praia da Luz that Thursday evening, the McCanns closed the apartment door and walked toward the restaurant, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that the night ahead would destroy their world. Because if the truth of what happened to Madeleine began inside apartment 5A, it wasn't a stranger who brought it there. By 8:30 p.m., the evening air around the Ocean Club was warm and still. The McCanns met their friends, known collectively as the Tapas 7, for dinner at the resort's restaurant. Laughter drifted through the open windows, glasses clinked, plates arrived steaming, and everything looked perfectly ordinary. But beneath the easy conversation and the casual smiles lay a script that would soon fracture under scrutiny. The Tapas restaurant sat about 55 meters from apartment 5A, a short walk, but just far enough to blur lines between vigilance and neglect. The McCanns had reserved a particular table that evening, one recorded in the restaurant's booking log. The note read clearly, "Children alone in the apartment." To some, it was a simple explanation for their choice of table. To others, it was the first line in a pre-written story, evidence meant to establish visibility and normalcy, the groundwork for a narrative that would later hinge on the claim, "We were always nearby." Throughout dinner, witnesses remembered Kate and Jerry as relaxed, even cheerful. They talked, laughed, and sipped wine. For parents whose children were alone in a ground-floor apartment, their calmness was unsettling. Some guests later admitted they found it strange, how at ease the couple seemed, how their body language carried no sign of worry. To many, this was just the comfort of routine. After all, they had followed the same pattern for nearly a week, but to others, it looked rehearsed, like a performance meant to prove that nothing unusual was happening that night. According to their story, the group agreed to check on their sleeping children every 25 to 30 minutes, rotating turns. It sounded responsible, organized, even loving, yet the later investigation would reveal cracks in this neat system. Timings didn't align, memories clashed, and details shifted in each retelling. What had seemed like simple parental cooperation began to look more like synchronization, an alibi carefully timed between witnesses. One key question has always lingered. Why didn't the McCanns use the resort's free babysitting service? For most parents, that would have been the safest, most natural choice, but they refused, insisting they preferred to handle the checks themselves. To investigators, that choice was more than preference. It was control. A babysitter might have noticed something they couldn't afford anyone else to see. At that dinner table, under the soft hum of conversation, time began to fracture. Every laugh, every sip of wine, every glance toward the apartment, if there was one, would later be dissected frame by frame. The McCann smiles would be replayed, their calmness reinterpreted, their every movement questioned. Because if Madeleine had already died earlier that evening, that dinner wasn't just a meal. It was the beginning of an act, a performance in which every detail, from the open patio door to the reserved table, would help build the illusion of innocence. The night moved on, slow and deceptive. The first check came at 9:05 p.m., when Jerry McCann rose from the table, smiled faintly at his friends, and walked back toward apartment 5A. What happened next would become the most scrutinized moment of the entire case. At 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann stood up from the tapas table and made his way back toward apartment 5A. The night was still, the pathways lit by a few dim lamps. What he claimed to have seen inside that apartment would later define the entire investigation. According to his statement, Jerry entered through the unlocked patio door, noticed that the bedroom door was open slightly more than usual, and saw all three children apparently asleep. He said Madeleine was lying peacefully in her bed, her pink pajamas visible in the faint glow from the hallway. He did not turn on the lights. He did not walk closer. He simply looked, adjusted the door, and left. It was, on paper, a brief and routine check, a loving father ensuring his children were safe. But viewed through the lens of what came later, Jerry's account feels strangely hollow. Why didn't he verify that his daughter was truly there? Why didn't he notice the open window or the raised shutter that would later become central to the abduction story? Even more puzzling, he seemed utterly calm when he returned to the restaurant, resuming dinner as if nothing had happened. 10 minutes later, at 9:15 p.m., Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, left the table to check on her own children. As she walked past the McCann's apartment, she later claimed she saw a man carrying a small child, dressed in light-colored pajamas, heading away from the resort. She said the child's feet were bare, the man's clothing dark. But she said nothing to anyone that night. Only after Kate raised the alarm did Jane mention her sighting, by then conveniently fitting the story of a supposed abduction. Investigators later identified the man as a tourist carrying his own daughter from a nearby childcare facility. But by then, the image of a barefoot girl in a stranger's arms had already burned into the public imagination. Whether Jane's sighting was an honest mistake, a distortion of memory, or a subconscious effort to support her friend's version of events, it became a cornerstone of the kidnapping narrative, one that, if untrue, shifted the real timeline even earlier. At 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield volunteered to perform another check on the McCann's children while checking on his own. He entered through the same unlocked patio door and noticed the bedroom door again open wide. He heard no sound and saw no movement. Crucially, he never walked close enough to see whether Madeleine was actually in bed. He would later admit that he could not say for certain that he saw her at all. 3 checks, 3 different accounts, 3 missed opportunities. Each one, instead of confirming safety, blurred the truth further. To skeptics, these visits were not coincidences, but choreography. Small, deliberate performances meant to create a paper trail of care, of presence, of innocence. If Madeleine had already died before dinner, then Jerry's casual glance, Jane's mysterious sighting, and Matthew's vague memory formed the backbone of a false timeline, proof that she was alive until 9:30 p.m. Psychologists studying the case suggested that Jerry's minimal inspection might reflect subconscious avoidance, a refusal to confront what he already feared or knew. Others believe it was deliberate, a necessary step to maintain the illusion that everything was normal. The open door, left slightly ajar, would later become both symbol and evidence, a doorway between truth and fiction. When pieced together, the hour between 9 WOOD and 10 COPM becomes the most critical and haunting stretch of the night. If the checks were genuine, they show tragic negligence. If they were staged, they reveal a calculated deception. Either way, they end in the same place. A mother's scream echoing through the dark and a child who would never be seen again. At exactly 10 p.m., Kate McCann rose from the table at the tapas restaurant for her turn to check on the children. The dinner had been lighthearted. There had been laughter, wine, quiet chatter. Nothing suggested that a storm was moments away. She walked the familiar path back to apartment 5A, through the garden and past the still air of the swimming pool. Yet, when she reached the patio, something felt wrong. The door was open wider than before. The window in the children's bedroom stood ajar, its shutter lifted. The curtains swayed slightly in the night breeze. On Madeleine's small bed lay her pink blanket and her beloved toy, Cuddle Cat, but the child herself was gone. Within seconds, Kate's voice shattered the silence. "They've taken her!" she screamed, racing back toward the restaurant. Her cry cut through the night, sending the resort into chaos. But even that scream, raw and desperate as it sounded, would become a focal point of suspicion. Why they've taken her? Why leap instantly to abduction when there was no sign of forced entry? No broken glass, no damage to the shutters, not even disturbed dust on the sill. To many investigators, that phrase felt rehearsed, like a line spoken at the wrong moment in a play already unfolding. Meanwhile, at nearly the same time, about 500 meters away, another family was walking home. Martin Smith and his relatives noticed a man carrying a small blonde girl through the narrow street, her arms limp, her head resting on his shoulder. She appeared to be asleep, or unconscious. Weeks later, after seeing footage of Jerry McCann returning to England carrying his son in a similar posture, Smith reported that the man's face and body movements looked eerily familiar. The Smith sighting and Kate's scream would become forever intertwined, two events occurring within minutes of each other, two halves of a chilling puzzle. If the man was Jerry, it meant he was away from the tapas group during the critical window. If so, what exactly was he carrying? And if Kate's scream was timed to follow his return, then what the world witnessed that night wasn't chaos. It was synchronization. Inside the apartment, the remaining twins still slept undisturbed. Kate did not wake them. She ran instead, leaving them alone once more to announce the kidnapping. Her panic might have been genuine, or it might have been part of a plan that demanded emotion before reason, a plan to shape the story before anyone could ask questions. Soon, lights flicked on across the resort. Guests emerged, staff rushed to help, phones rang, but the scream had already done its work. It had framed the night as a kidnapping, ensured the focus would shift outward, to strangers, to intruders, to anyone but the two people closest to the child. As confusion spread, one fact became fixed. Between 10 BC and 10:41 p.m., no one called the police. More than half an hour would pass before authorities were notified. In that gap, 31 phone calls were made, to friends, to family, but not to law enforcement. It was a silence heavy with implications, because what happens immediately after discovery often tells more truth than the discovery itself. And in that 31-minute void, the story of Madeleine McCann began to twist into something darker than anyone could have imagined. From 10:10 to 10:41 p.m., time in Praia da Luz seemed to bend. What should have been 31 minutes of frantic urgency, parents racing to the phone, shouting for help, calling the police, became instead a void of confusion, a haze of private calls and whispered coordination. The McCanns and their friends made 31 phone calls in that half hour, none of them to law enforcement. The official call to the Portuguese police was not logged until 10:41 p.m., long after Kate's scream had echoed through the resort. Those lost minutes have haunted the case ever since. Every parent's instinct in such a moment would be to act, to call emergency services, to lock the doors, to search. Yet Jerry delegated the task to his friend, Matthew Oldfield, instructing him to alert the front desk rather than contact police directly. In those early moments, evidence that could have clarified what happened was likely destroyed, moved, or contaminated. The apartment filled with people, neighbors, friends, resort staff, trampling over potential clues. Critics saw the delay not as confusion, but as control. If Madeleine had died earlier in the evening, those 31 minutes might have been used to synchronize stories, rehearse timelines, and make sure every member of the Tapos group knew what to say when the authorities finally arrived. Others suggest an even darker explanation, that Jerry needed that time to return from wherever he had taken Madeleine's body after the Smith family sighting, ensuring that when police arrived, both parents would be back together, unified in grief. But as days turned into weeks, the physical evidence began to tell its own story, one that pointed not outward, but inward. British cadaver dogs, Eddie and Keela, were brought to the Ocean Club in August 2007. Eddie, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, alerted in several key places, behind the sofa and inside the wardrobe of apartment 5A, on Kate McCann's clothing, and on Madeleine's favorite toy, Cuddle Cat. Keela, trained to detect traces of human blood, confirmed the same spots behind the sofa. The dogs also reacted to the trunk of the Renault Scenic the McCanns rented 6 weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. The findings were impossible to ignore. Kate explained the cadaver scent on her clothes and the toy by referencing her medical background, claiming she may have come into contact with deceased patients at work. But experts rejected this explanation. Cadaver dogs react to very specific markers of human decomposition, and the alerts appeared only in places directly connected to Madeleine. Forensic analysis later revealed partial DNA consistent with Madeleine's genetic profile inside the trunk of the Renault Scenic. The sample was degraded and mixed, making it legally inconclusive, but the implication was chilling. Why would any trace of Madeleine's DNA exist in a car rented weeks after she vanished? Compounding suspicion, the vehicle had been driven over 3,000 kilometers in just 3 days, for reasons never fully explained. Empty vials of sedatives found among Kate's belongings added yet another layer to the puzzle. If the medication had been used to help the children sleep, a miscalculated dose could have led to accidental death. In that case, the open patio door, the staged checks, and the delayed police call might all fit into a single grim sequence, a desperate effort to cover up a fatal mistake. Even the toy that had once symbolized a mother's love became a silent witness. Cuddle Cat, washed by Kate soon after the disappearance, carried the scent of death when tested. To some, it was just coincidence. To others, it was the most damning clue of all. The contrast was striking: a mother weeping on camera, a father coordinating searches, and, behind the scenes, evidence that whispered another story entirely. Whether by panic or intention, the truth of what happened in apartment 5A seemed to have been buried beneath performance. By the time investigators pieced together these clues, the scene had long gone cold. What remained were traces: a smell, a stain, a silence that could not be explained away. And as the world waited for justice, the story of Madeleine McCann was no longer just about a missing child. It had become a test of truth itself, of how far two people could go to maintain a lie. When the Portuguese police finally arrived at apartment 5A, the chance to preserve the truth was already gone. The scene had been contaminated, witnesses confused, timelines blurred beyond repair. What should have been the beginning of an investigation instead became the start of a narrative war. One fought in courtrooms, newsrooms, and the hearts of millions who wanted to believe the story of abduction. In the weeks that followed, Kate and Jerry McCann transformed from grieving parents into public figures. Cameras followed their every step. Press conferences were carefully staged, and interviews appeared on international television. Within days, they launched the Find Madeleine Fund, opened bank accounts, hired public relations advisors, and secured top-tier lawyers. For many observers, this seemed like desperate hope, a way to keep their daughter's face on the front page. But to skeptics, it looked rehearsed, controlled, and unnervingly strategic. By September 2007, the Portuguese authorities named both Kate and Jerry as arguidos, formal suspects. The decision was based on the cadaver dog alerts, DNA traces, and inconsistencies in their testimonies. Kate's refusal to answer 48 police questions only deepened the shadows around them. Yet, less than a year later, the charges were lifted. The official reason: insufficient evidence. Unofficially, the whispers pointed to something else: pressure. The involvement of then UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown raised eyebrows across Europe. He personally contacted Portuguese officials, urging cooperation and support for the McCanns. Never before had a missing child case drawn such high-level political attention. To critics, it looked like protection, a shield of influence surrounding a well-connected British couple. The case, they said, had become too political to touch. Years passed, leads faded. Then, in 2020, attention shifted toward a new name: Christian Bruckner, a German drifter and convicted sex offender who had lived in the Algarve around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. His criminal history made him an easy target for suspicion, and soon he was declared the prime suspect. But no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no direct evidence ever tied him to Madeleine. To many, Bruckner's introduction felt like a convenient diversion, a story reset that pulled public focus away from the lingering doubts about Kate and Jerry. Meanwhile, the McCanns maintained a dual image: public grief and private resilience. They appeared at memorials, released statements on anniversaries, and gave interviews filled with faith and heartbreak. Kate continued to buy Christmas presents for Madeleine each year, keeping them stored away for when she comes home. To some, this was the tender hope of a mother refusing to surrender. To others, it was performance, a way to sustain the narrative of innocence. Psychologists who studied the case described their behavior as compartmentalization, the ability to divide emotion and logic, to act with composure while carrying a buried truth. Whether born of trauma or strategy, their calm control contrasted too sharply with the gravity of what had happened. Their every appearance became a puzzle. Were these the faces of endurance or manipulation? As the years dragged on, the case turned from investigation to obsession. Online forums and documentaries dissected every frame of footage, every word spoken, every contradiction. Supporters argued that no parent could endure such scrutiny if guilty. Skeptics countered that no performance could last this long without practice. The truth remained lost somewhere between those two worlds. Today, nearly 2 decades later, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann stands as both tragedy and cautionary tale. It exposed the fragility of truth in the face of influence, the power of narrative over fact, and the unsettling realization that appearances can be the most dangerous form of disguise. If the McCanns are innocent, they are victims twice, first of a crime, then of suspicion. But if they are guilty, they didn't just lose a daughter. They rewrote her story, turned grief into image, and built a wall of sympathy to hide behind. And so, the question remains, echoing across the years through documentaries, police files, and sleepless nights in Praia da Luz, where did Madeleine go that night? Until that question is answered, every open window, every child's cry in the dark, and every whispered denial will carry her name.